My name is Ashley Klein-Jimenez, and this is our web conference today titled Shared Vision, Shared Work, Engaging Multi-Sector Partners for Sexual and Intimate Partner Violence Prevention. This is your Prevent Connect team that's joining you today, myself, and I also have my colleague Tori Vandeland in the room with me. Tori, how are you?
Hi, Ashley. I'm great. How are you?
Good, thank you. So I want to let everyone know that while it's so wonderful to connect with you all on our web conferences, there are other places that you can connect with us, and we'd love for you to connect with us. So feel free to send us an email, info@preventconnect.org. If you have questions, if there are resources you're looking for, maybe we featured a guest that you would love to contact. We could probably help you get in contact with that person. Feel free to email us there. We also have an email group where there are, over like 1,400 other prevention practitioners that are sharing resources, asking questions, really just connecting around so many of the issues that we're all working around, and so we welcome you to join that. We also have an e-learning website, learn.preventconnect.org, where you can take all sorts of prevention-related courses at your own pace. If you want to maybe increase some of your learning around prevention, if there are specific topics that you're interested in, or if you're new to prevention, that's a really, really great place to get some additional education. And then we'd also love for you to follow us on our social media. We are really active on Twitter and Facebook. So some of the technology that we'll be using today, so obviously we're not together in person, but that doesn't mean that we cannot have a conversation. It doesn't mean that we can't build connections, that we can't interact with one another. And so one of the reasons why we love using Adobe Connect is because of this text chat function that so many of you have already used and told us where you're from and what the weather's like. And so throughout the course of this web conference, we'll be asking you to use that text chat box to answer questions, to ask questions. If you have questions for our presenters, that's a great place to put them. If you have your own insight, things that you'd like to share about the topic, we'd love for you to use that because we know there's so much collective wisdom in this room, and so we'd love to be able to really lift that up. We'll also be sharing the PowerPoint slides that we are going to be looking at. So if you want to download those, they are available. Tori has put a link to where you can find those. If you're streaming audio over your internet and are having any trouble with that, we do have a phone number that you'll probably find the audio is better on. And so if you are able to use a phone line, we would love for you to join us over there, and Tori put that number. We also have live streaming closed captioning. You should see that under these webinar web conference slides, and that's from our friends at Aberdeen Captioning, so thank you so much to Aberdeen. So I want to do a couple of polling questions just to get to know our audience a little bit better, and so the first question that should just automatically pop up on your screen is asking if you've attended a web conference before today. There are 4 answers, or you could choose to not participate. I am broadcasting the results live, and so you should see how folks who are answering are responding, and you'll see that there are probably the largest majority of you have been on web conferences before, specifically Prevent Connect web conferences, but there's quite a few of you who have either never attended a web conference or this is your very first Prevent Connect web conference. So thank you to everyone, whether you're returning as part of our community or you're just joining our community. We're so happy to have you, and thank you for participating in that. The next question that will pop up on your screen is really just asking you to select what would best describe the agency or organization that you are affiliated with. And so there's a rather long list of options. But if you scroll all the way down to the bottom, there is an other category in case you're not finding something that describes where you're coming from. And if you do select that, and it looks like so far one person already has, we'd love for you to share what would describe the organization or agency that you are affiliated with in the text chat. So just scrolling up, I can see that many folks are with sexual violence or domestic violence agencies or coalitions or dual coalitions or agencies. We have folks from health departments. We have folks from colleges and universities. Let's see, mental health, healthcare. There are a handful of you that have selected other, and so it looks like state government, a CCR. And Candace, is that, could you say, is that a coordinated community response perhaps? Or I might be getting that acronym wrong, so let me know. But you can see that we do have, folks from anti-trafficking organizations or programs. We have a nice range of folks. And, these web conferences we're talking about partnerships today, and I'm just going to put it out there that these are a good opportunity for you to invite your partners that are working in other sectors and other areas. Okay, so I took that away, so you shouldn't see that on your screen anymore. For those of you who are new to Prevent Connect, we are really interested in the primary prevention of sexual violence, of intimate partner violence. So really before it ever happens, that's what we're interested in is how do we stop it from ever occurring in the first place? We look at violence across the lifespan, so this does include child sexual abuse. And we know that in order to really get to primary prevention, we have to connect our issue to other forms of violence and oppression. We have to look at those root causes of violence. We have to look at the shared factors among different forms of violence, and we need to connect and talk with one another. And so that's why I'm really excited about this conversation today, because I think that we're really going to hear from our guests on how they've been able to make those connections, connect with one another, and really advance the work that they're doing. So this web conference is being recorded. So once again, you are here for Shared Vision, Shared Work, Engaging Multisector Partners for Sexual and Intimate Partner Violence Prevention. Prevent Connect is a national project of the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault, sponsored by the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The views and information provided in this web conference do not necessarily represent the official views of the U.S. government, CDC, or CalCASA. So our objectives today is that we're really looking to be able to identify opportunities to engage non-traditional partners in order to advance some of the community level work that you're doing to prevent sexual and intimate partner violence. We're going to be looking at specifically a tool from our friends at Prevention Institute called the Collaboration Multiplier, and one of our guests has some great experience using that tool, so we'll get her insights with that. And then we want to really think about who do we partner with, how do we partner with them, and towards what ends? Like, what is the point of these partnerships, right? We need to know what the point of them is before we engage in them. And so I really wanted to start off with this quote from Dr. Deborah Prothrow-Stiff. Let me get Dr. Deborah's name right, from the Harvard School of Public Health. And Dr. Prothrow-Stiff says, violence is not the problem of one neighborhood or group, and the response and solutions are not the responsibility of one sector of the community or of one agency, professional group, or business. Coming together and owning this problem and the solutions are central. And it's certainly true that one group or one agency, one coalition, one health department, one campus, whatever it is, cannot solve the issue of sexual and intimate partner violence on their own. If that was a possibility, it would have been done, and we probably would not be having this conversation. We'd be well aware of those successes. But what we do know is that it truly does take the voices and experiences and resources and commitments of many. And that's why I'm really looking forward to having a deeper conversation today about multi-sector partnerships. And we have a guest from a coalition, from a state public health department, and a local agency to really show a range of what those partnerships can look like. So before we get to our guests, I'm just interested in hearing from you all. Why are you on this web conference? What do you see as the benefits of collaboration? Like why should we be collaborating? What are your thoughts around that? And I think that there are some kind of easy things to point to, and we'll certainly do that. But we really want to know from you all, like what are the benefits that you see, either that you've experienced or that you just think are out there for collaborating. So we'll let folks start to answer, and thank you so much for those of you who are already putting in the text chat. More people, less duplication, different perspectives, additional viewpoints and experiences, all of these things that are coming up. Really appreciate you sharing these, and Tori's going to be keeping an eye to see some themes. But I'll move on, and I think that a lot of these things are already coming up that you all are saying, and that's really that you can share resources, and so there's an increase in resource. You can strengthen credibility when you're collaborating with folks, right? When you have a multitude of people behind a specific issue, that can really strengthen your credibility. You can broaden the influence, the reach, and the impact, and it's more sustainable when it's not just one individual or one entity that is, engaged in a specific activity, strategy, or approach. So Tori, I want to kick it over to you and just see what else folks are saying, because boy, those text chats started coming in.
Yeah, wow, that really started moving fast. Thank you all for those of you who have written in and those who continue to write into the text chat. So some of the benefits of collaboration that you all identified are very similar to the ones that we identified on the screen. Monty had said community accountability, increased protections from trauma risk, decreased risks of trauma, end racism and gender-based violence. Yes, so we're connecting to other issues as well that we know impact violence, and making sure that those people and those issues are front and center. Emma Blanco says, I can't know everything and I don't want to. Absolutely. So we're building on those strengths of our partners and our collaborators and building more comprehensive prevention systems too. And there also was a lot coming up about different perspectives and getting different viewpoints, sharing resources, building strength. Sharing resources, fresh eyes from Lakeisha. Thank you, Lakeisha. Reaching a wider group of people, having more expertise and different approaches at the table. So thank you all for your responses. Ashley, did I miss any of the themes that you also saw coming up?
Well, I just saw Falguna says to influence cultural shift more towards anti-oppression. So I think that goes again with having different viewpoints, different voices at the table, people that are working on issues that are connected to sexual and intimate partner violence. And so yeah, I mean, I think that what I'm hearing from everyone is that there's a lot of benefits of partnerships and collaborations that we're really well aware of. And I think that there's also a lot of power behind collaboration in order to create change. Because collaborations and partnerships, when they're developed strategically, they can do other things. So one of the things that I want to point to, and this slide is a representative of that, is that over the years, CDC has been providing a lot of leadership around shared risk and protective factors. And so an example of that is this publication that you see on your screen of preventing multiple forms of violence, a strategic vision for connecting the dots. So this came after the Connecting the Dots document to really look at how do we connect the dots, how do we identify those shared risk and protective factors and prevent multiple forms of violence at once. And one of the things that this document really lifts up is that collaboration is a cornerstone of this work. Like it has to be there. And multi-sector partnerships are really critical in being able to identify shared risk and protective factors and finding solutions to prevent the various forms of violence. And so another place that I think those of you in this web conference are very familiar with is that CDC has been highlighting the power and importance of multi-sector partnerships through their technical packages. And so to date, there have been 6 technical packages released, with the latest release being Preventing Adverse Childhood Experiences, or ACEs, that was released just, I think, in the past month. And really, these technical packages feature violence prevention strategies and approaches that were selected using the best available evidence. And they're meant to be used in combination with a multi-sector effort to prevent violence. And so if you read the technical packages, you'll see that there are many sectors vital to implementing what's in the technical packages, and some of them are, we need folks from education, from government, from social services, from healthcare services, from business, from housing, from faith-based organizations. We need a multitude of sectors to be able to implement these technical packages. So I think that's another really good example. I think, too, the importance of multi-sector partnerships is further illustrated in this risk and protective factor infographic that the National Sexual Violence Resource Center released earlier this year. And the infographic, and Tori put a link to where you can find this and you can look at it. I know it's not very large on our screen, but the infographic really maps out risk and protective factors for sexual violence across the social ecological model. And what I love about it is that it also includes corresponding social determinants of health, which is another way for saying the conditions and environments in which people are born, live, work, play, age, etc. And so you can find that. But this quote is actually from the risk and protective factor infographic. And I think that what it shows us is that risk and protective factors can connect us to others who are doing complementary work. And so I think Tori, the text chat comment that you pulled out around like anti-racism really speaks to that. And so there are risk and protective factors common to many public health issues such as suicide, bullying, teen dating violence. And there are connections to efforts to increase healthy families and communities, to create pay equity, economic justice, to end racism, and other forms of oppression. And so NSBRC says we can work together around shared risk and protective factors to stretch limited funding, create and strengthen partnerships, and increase reach, which is so much of what you all were saying. So Tori, I'd love to pass it over to you to kind of further explore how we can envision multi-sector roles in preventing violence.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. So we've seen kind of how it lays out with risk and protective factors from the National Sexual Violence Resource Center, but also our colleagues over at the Prevention Institute have another way of looking at multi-sector roles in preventing violence. So the way that they frame it is around structural drivers and community determinants of domestic violence. But then when we look at prevention, we're looking at structural drivers and community determinants of safe relationships. So within the Prevention Institute's Thrive framework, they see these community determinants of domestic violence and safe relationships taking place across people, the who, the place, the where, and equitable opportunity. So what are the other factors going on in the systems that impact our lives that change the ways that people interact with places? So you can see on your screens that the community determinants of domestic violence span all three of these areas, as do the community determinants of prevention and safe relationships. And everything that's listed in the community determinants of domestic violence within the people, place, and equitable opportunity circles are modifiable. And we know that as prevention practitioners. And on the second chart, it shows how we can modify those, or what that modification can look like. So as Ashley had said, all of the multi-sector approaches that we think about, and when we think about prevention, We know that sexual and intimate partner violence is not a one-sector issue, and we also don't live one-sector lives. So we need to have multi-sector solutions for sexual and intimate partner violence, and that can span across where we live. So the housing sector, community development, the planning sector, and zoning sector all impact norms, social cohesion. They impact alcohol outlet density, affordable housing, media and marketing, whether that's changing harmful ones or promoting good media and marketing. They can also impact economic security for families and communities. And we have also talked before about ways that these sectors can impact design elements that can prevent against violence, as well as greening urban spaces. We've had conversations about that before. And what's really important is to engage these sectors as we're talking about changing environments for prevention, to also engage them in anti-displacement and anti-gentrification work as well. Where we work also has a big impact on the norms and culture and community that we can create to be free from violence. So this can mean things like having safe workplace policies. Again, this also ties back into economic security. There's also some points around organizational culture and paid family leave policy, or the acceptability of taking paid family leave, as well as, of course, pay equity as well. We can also look at where we connect and play, and so this is how we engage our sports sector, our entertainment sector, and our faith sector, which all have big impacts on our norms and culture, social networks and trust, and other things as well. And the faith community as well can have an impact on economic security. It's also important that when we look at these sectors to realize they're not just for our consumption, but they're also employers too. So it ties back to the same strategies and the same opportunities for prevention when we look at where we work. And finally, when we look at where we receive care, this is also an opportunity to promote healthy norms and build strong social networks too. And especially in the healthcare sector and the social services sector, these sectors already have experience and expertise with changing community determinants and gathering and analyzing data that can help inform our prevention efforts. So before we introduce our guests, I think it would be really great to hear from you all. Who are you currently partnering with, and what sectors are you engaging in your prevention efforts? And I'm pasting that text chat question into the text box for you all to answer as Ashley introduces our first set of guests.
Thanks, Tori. So yeah, I'm excited to see who folks are partnering with. You know, I think that sometimes there's kind of like some of the, should I say usual suspects? I mean, the folks that, right, it makes sense because maybe we're doing some school-based curriculum, so we need to partner with schools. And then I think that there's some other, like, really maybe more, what is the word I'm looking for? Not unusual, but just folks that we wouldn't necessarily think to partner with, that when we do kind of think through to what end we're trying to partner with people, it does make more sense. So I'm excited to see some of those come up. So with that, because I cannot form sentences today appropriately, I'm going to stop talking. So I'd love to introduce you all to Sarah Earhard-Reed. Sarah is the RP Director at the Missouri Department of Health and Senior Services. And Matthew Huffman. Matthew is the Public Affairs Director for the Missouri Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence. And Sarah and Matthew, thank you for joining us today. You know, Tori and I have had the pleasure of seeing you all talk about some of the work that you've done around multi-sector partnerships and even just the partnership that you two have. And so we would love to turn it over to you and have you talk through what that looks like and what are some of the lessons that you all have learned.
Thanks, Ashley.
Of course.
Excuse me. Thank you, Ashley.
You got it.
So just to kind of get us started, as Ashley mentioned, Sarah and I have known each other for the better part of a decade and have worked together in a variety of capacities. So we have that kind of individual relationship and background, but thinking about it from our field and our professions, we kind of wanted to talk through how you can align the work. And Sarah and I actually gave this presentation earlier this year at the RPE leadership meeting. So we were with other coalitions and health departments and some external evaluators, and we began that presentation also by talking about aligning your mission. And part of the reason that we think that's such an important place to start is that it provides a good foundation to understand your shared values and your shared interests. So just to draw a couple comparisons here between our missions. The Missouri Department of Health and Senior Services has a charge to be the leader in promoting, protecting, and partnering for health. And then when you look at our mission at the Missouri Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence, we work to unite Missourians with the shared value that rape and abuse must end, and we advance this through education, alliance, research, and public policy. So you can already see that there are some overlaps there. Being the leader in the state, uniting Missourians, that really kind of promotes shared leadership, shared accountability, and transparency in our work. Whenever we're working to protect and partner for health, we consider that a big part of our alliance building, a big part of education, research, and public policy that we do at the coalition. And so we kind of wanted to get the conversation started here because I also think whenever you start to look at maybe more multidisciplinary partnerships, developing other more non-traditional partnerships, that if you start from this foundation, it creates a point of connection that should conflict arise or when and if the relationship needs to be reevaluated, you have this starting point that you can go back to. Is there anything that you would add, Sarah?
No, I think it's interesting that both of our missions say from the beginning that we know we can't do this work alone, that we have to work together in order to get our goals accomplished. And while not everyone's mission may have partnering or alliance, explicitly stated like ours do, I do think that there's almost always some sort of like common theme, either in our missions or vision statements or goals that we can really use to build the foundation of as to why it makes sense to work with an organization or a person. So.
So language matters. Sarah, I'm going to let you talk about this because I think that you do a really fantastic job.
Thank you. So one of the things that we think about when we're working with new partners is how the way we talk about our work can really vary depending upon our field and our discipline and our jargon. And so I like to cook. I like to think about food a lot. And so when I think about the work that we do, we may all see the same thing on the screen, right? But we're going to call it something completely different. So I may call it like a sub sandwich, but like other people may call it a grinder or a hoagie, right? There's lots of different names for the same sort of like combination of things, right? Like bread, meat, or veggies, cheese maybe, right? So like it's the same physical object, but the way we talk about it, the words we use to describe it might be a little bit different. And I think that that's like an important starting point for us as we think about engaging with different organizations or folks that we've not worked with before, is that we may use different words to mean the same thing, or that the same acronyms, for example, might mean completely different things in our different fields. So just starting with that same foundation of like making sure we're all on the same page with the language that we're using really helps set the stage for a stronger, easier partnership. And ultimately, when it comes down to doing the work, it doesn't really matter what we call the sandwich, right? Or if we call it a sub, a sandwich, a grinder hoagie, whatever you want to call it. If it tastes delicious, right? Or like in the case of our work, if it's making our community safer, or it's bringing people together to get our work accomplished, then it doesn't really matter what we call it, right? So I think being flexible in our language and setting that stage early on really helps make a successful partnership.
Thanks, Sarah. And I think, that's such an important consideration because there is so much work that's happening in other sectors or with other, organizations and communities that when we look at it, they're really getting to some of the risk and protective factors that we want to impact. But they may not, like you said, use that same language. And so I also think that as prevention practitioners, we have to kind of be able to recognize when that's happening, and then also have the tools and language to be able to make those connections for people. Because I do think that that folks, when those connections are made, are really excited that their work is, having a larger impact than maybe what they had originally intended.
Yeah, definitely. And I think another thing to be clear about when we talk about partnerships is what do we mean by that? So like Matthew said, we've talked about partnerships before in other settings, and because it's something we get really excited about. And so one of the questions that always comes up is what do you mean by partner? Who do you count as a partner? And so for us, we use this sort of graphic to help us kind of talk about the different range of partnerships, what we can expect from folks. And so we have a little thank you here from Pam Brown. She works with the CDC, and she's shared this tool with us before. And so we just find it really useful in thinking about partnerships. And so for partnerships for us, like I said, it's a continuum. So it could be anyone that you're working with to accomplish your mission, right? So if you're working to prevent sexual violence, domestic violence, help survivors, whatever your mission is that you're hoping to accomplish, it's the folks that you're engaging in that work to get that done. It could be people that, looking at this sort of graphic on the left that you network with, so you're just exchanging information, all the way to people on the right that you're collaborating with. So those are the people that, you work really closely with. You're exchanging information and you're working together on different activities. You're sharing resources, and you both help each other improve your work. You help each other build your capacity to do the work. And I think that it's important to value all partnerships, whether they're at the networking, coordinating, cooperating, collaborating stage. And this is a pretty formal definition, but I think they all bring something to the table and they can all help us do our work. And it's okay for a partnership to grow stronger over time or to change dynamics, right? So maybe you work on a project together, and when the project is accomplished, you don't need to collaborate anymore. You can just coordinate going forward. But that you recognize the value in all the different types of partnerships. But when we talk about partners, that's kind of the frame and the lens that we use to see that. Matthew, did you have anything to add to that?
Only just to lift up something that you said there about the value of partnership and really paying attention to the value that both you and any potential partner bring to the work that you're doing. And then just to reiterate that these steps are fluid, meaning that they can and will change over time. And that isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's just something that can be looked at more on a case-by-case, project-by-project basis, and that is perfectly fine. But the thing that I think is really important to focus on in this graphic are the two arrows at the top. That it does take time to develop that level of trust, but as you do, you see a decrease in the level of turf wars. And so even if you move from a place of strong collaboration back to coordination or networking, that is going to take time and trust to develop, but if you put the time into it, it's far less likely that you're going to develop that conflict and turf issue.
Yeah, excellent point.
So once again, thanks to Pam Brown, one of our favorite CDC folks, who also gave us this quote about partnerships and public health. So partnerships are relationships between public health and other sectors that are formal and informal in nature, where skills and assets are shared to improve the public's health, and each partner shares in the risk and rewards from the results of the partnership. And the part there in bold is what I think is really important to pay attention to, is that together across sectors, we are working to improve the public's health, and that each partner shares in the risk and reward as a result of that. So with this graphic, I think it really kind of helps to show that these cogs represent that each sector has an important role to play, that they complement one another, and ultimately that allows us to be stronger and more effective in our efforts. So just like Ashley mentioned earlier, the benefits of multi-sector partnerships are really a cornerstone to our work. And so it might be easy for us to see how the government and nonprofit sectors work together, but how does the business sector factor in? Well, just as Tori mentioned earlier, there's a huge role for promoting pay equity and economic justice. I also saw in the text chat earlier, someone brought up that there's a really important aspect of intergenerational mentorship and learning opportunities. All of these things together can really increase our reach and impact of our work. Is there anything you would add to that, Sarah?
No, I think you hit the nail on the head with that one.
So looking at some traditional partnerships, the Department of Health and Senior Services and the Coalition have worked together for a long time. But we have started a partnership with Missouri Partners in Prevention, which is a coalition of 23 public and private colleges and universities in Missouri. So that can seem like a traditional partnership for a few reasons. One, we know that sexual violence on college campuses is a major public health concern. Just yesterday, the University of Missouri put out their report from their most recent participation in the American Association of Universities report on sexual violence, sexual misconduct on college campuses. And so we know that one in four women or individuals who identify as women experience sexual violence. And so that is our research and evidence to show that this is a major public health concern. So it makes sense that we would bring these partners together to work on the issue. It's also more of a traditional partnership because, especially in the last few years, preventing sexual violence on college campuses has been part of the national dialogue and discourse. And so the state of Missouri actually participated in the CDC and American Public Health Association first cohort of action planning meetings to really come up with a comprehensive statewide plan of how we could start addressing this in our state. And so these are just a couple examples of how this can seem like a more traditional partnership between the three of us. That being said, it's taken a lot of time to get to a really good place where we can model what that partnership looks like for folks on a local level.
Matthew, so thank you for mentioning the CDC and APHA action planning process for sexual violence prevention on college campuses, because I think that one thing that meeting did, and so for those of you who maybe aren't familiar with that, essentially it brought together folks from sexual violence coalitions, health departments, and the university over, I think, like a 2-day period to really sit and strategize around, how do we make change on a college campus? How do we come at this issue from a state level? And so 2 things come to my mind. Number one is we don't often have like 2 full days to sit with our partners. Right? In like a facilitated setting. So that's a really, what an opportunity. But then I think it goes back to the fact that partnerships and that relationship building piece and that trust building is so important to establishing any type of, sustainable partnership. But then the second thing is that it reminds me when we talk about public or multi-sector partnerships and working with different sectors, when we talk about working with institutions like a university, they run so differently than what so many of us who are working in, local community agencies or coalitions or even health departments are really used to. And so there's a lot that we have to learn about each other's institutions and sectors, right? And I'm wondering if you have any experience with that.
Yeah, and I'm really glad that you brought that up, that so much of this work is based on getting to know one another and know the different dynamics of the institutions we're working alongside. So another example of kind of how there's an overlap between the three of us, we have members of the coalition that are sexual violence programs on college campuses. Some of those campuses are funded to do violence prevention work through the Department of Health. And the overlap there is that all of them are members of Missouri Partners in Prevention. And so to your point, Ashley, about getting to know and understand institutions, whenever we can take the time to get to know one another and the way that our institutions operate, we can be much more efficient and effective in supporting each other in those efforts. Because state government is a huge institution all of its own. Individual campuses have their own way of operating. And so that's a different dynamic that you have to learn. But yeah, I mean, I think being able to just spend the time to really look at where your efforts can align and complement one another is such an important aspect.
Mm-hmm. And I think from our perspective, and Matthew, just to add to that, one thing that we've learned in working more from the funding role with our different campuses is, and working, across the board just in building partnerships, is that, like you said, every campus works a little bit differently, but there are a lot of commonalities. And so you can kind of build on some of the lessons learned, right? So if one organization maybe has a hard time pushing something through, that might not be the case, but it helps you be more prepared to face challenges with other partners that are similar.
Yeah. Thanks, Sarah.
Sure.
So then a non-traditional case example, our coalition has a board member who works at the Missouri Chamber of Commerce and Industry. And after that board member joined, we really started looking at some of the joint benefits and really digging into reasons why collaboration with the Missouri Chamber of Commerce and Industry makes sense. And one is just the fact that we're both membership organizations. And so the work that we do on the statewide level can directly benefit the work of member programs on the local level to interact with their local chamber. It also helps us to really align our public policy efforts. So if we are both a membership organization that relies heavily on feedback from member programs to help set our public policy priorities, then it makes sense for us to work alongside other statewide associations and organizations. And then another thing is sexual harassment, sexual assault, intimate partner violence. These are all economic and labor issues, just like we talked about earlier. And so it makes sense that if people are spending a huge part of their life at work, that we would want to be working with the people who set policy and procedure in their businesses to make sure that they are survivor-centered, to make sure that they are also promoting the prevention of sexual harassment and assault and creating protective environments for all of their employees. So it makes sense that we would partner together. Another really specific example to cross over between a traditional partnership and our non-traditional partnership. A couple of years ago, there were some interns in the Missouri State Capitol who blew the whistle on experiencing sexual harassment and assault from some of our elected officials. So we pulled together a group of campus representatives by partnering with Partners in Prevention. And we did basically a SWOT analysis of what already exists on campuses, what exists in the community, and what are really important aspects for us to do in order to prevent interns from being sexually harassed and assaulted as they're just getting out into the job market. So what we ended up doing was creating a website called the Intern Resource Network. And the intention is to be able to connect colleges and universities with local domestic and sexual violence programs, and also to partner with local businesses and organizations to really work on creating protective environments, as well as helping students understand their rights under both Title IX and the EEOC, because there is a pretty big gap there. So we developed the Intern Resource Network, and then about a year ago, the Missouri Chamber of Commerce and Industry launched a site called Intern Connect. And it's an opportunity for businesses to post their internship opportunities around the state. With our connection to the Missouri Chamber, we were able to get them to link on their website to our website, and we've begun developing collaboration and cross-promotion of our site. Then thinking about how these state-level efforts can support local-level efforts. We had another staff member at the coalition who participated in the Missouri Chamber of Commerce and Industry's Leadership Missouri program. And those are things that happen on the local level too. So we have another board member who is the executive director of the Safe House for Women in Cape Girardeau. She went through the local Cape Leadership Program there at the Chamber. And whenever I was chatting with her about that experience, she was saying that it was so vitally important just to have the ability to learn more about community priorities that other folks have identified and to be able to network with those other community leaders. And a really specific example of that is that the Cape Chamber also has a women's network where they meet regularly to discuss various issues that are coming up in the community. And one of the issues that they identified is that there was a lack of affordable childcare in the area. And so they decided as a group that it was really important for them to work on bringing down the cost of childcare, because they were seeing women and families leaving the area because they just couldn't afford to be there any longer. And so while the folks sitting in that room at the Chamber Women's Network might not have identified affordable childcare as a public health and violence prevention issue, it absolutely is, because those of us working in public health know that if you have access to affordable childcare, you have created an environment that promotes equity and empowerment for women, and it's creating a place where women and families can more actively be a part of the community and stay connected in the community. So it kind of goes back to this idea of why language matters. The people who are doing prevention work in your community might not be identifying it, but the fact that we can identify those things and then connect each other and celebrate in those successes is incredibly important.
Thank you, Matthew. I love the way that you were able to highlight some of the state level examples, and then all the way down to the community level, the local level. And I think that, again, that goes back to, in a way, we are so lucky in this work to have some research now that kind of lays out like what are some strategies and approaches that we can look at that have some evidence behind them, and how does that connect to some of these other issues that people are really passionate about and have been doing work around for forever. And now how do we support that work, right? With resources or just us being there, like a friendly face, right? To work alongside that. So thank you so much for sharing all of that.
Of course.
And here at the health department, we also have started to work within our organization to build some more non-traditional partnerships among different programs. We started working on our state action plan, which is a requirement of our rape prevention education grant. Back in December, we started working together. And as a part of our action planning group, we were discussing who wasn't at the table, like who else did we need to have invited. And one of our members of the group said, well, we would like to see more people from the department here. Who are other people that you can work with? And so we reached out to a network that we've traditionally been a part of, right? So building on our traditional partnerships, which is our Injury and Violence Prevention Advisory Committee. And so this is what we're looking at doing. Who else in the department should we be working with? And because I'm sure like a lot of other large organizations, sometimes it can be a bit siloed in trying to find other folks that would be good fits for partners. And they recommended reaching out to a group in our department that does work around Missouri's Livable Streets initiative. And so we were able to meet with them and just sit down and explain, what our goals are in our work and learn more about what they're doing and what their projects are, and to kind of find where there was overlap. So after sitting down together, we were able to see that it would be a really good fit for me to participate in their Missouri Livable Streets Advisory Committee. And the vision of that group is to work towards inclusive, mobile, and healthy places to move throughout the state. So for us, that was really a neat, interesting overlap, because this group is working with other CDC funding to reduce obesity and to increase connection to everyday destinations. And when we saw that work in our office, we thought, wow, they're working to build community connectedness. So again, that sandwich, like the work looks the same, but how they're building those partnerships and those connections, we can see a little bit differently. So then we've started going to those groups and just kind of sharing some information with them. And they'll start coming to our groups as well, so we can start sharing information with them. And so I think that's a good example of how, the partnership, like I said earlier, it may not be in the full collaboration, but we're definitely, networking. We're sharing resources and information together. And I think that will help all of our local programs better understand how the work is relevant, right? So when city planning is working on sidewalks, that also relates to domestic and sexual violence, and kind of showing that example at the state level helps local programs understand that too. So.
Thank you, Sarah. And I think that is really great to see coming from like the state level to model some of that work. And, and I think I go back to your slide that showed kind of those different levels of collaboration. And so I think like maybe most multi-sector partnerships or, collaborative partnerships do start off at that lowest level. And then depending on kind of like the community needs, right, then you see if that partnership needs to kind of scale up. Right. Well, thank you for walking us through that. Well, thank you both for sharing some of the work that you all are engaged with together, and then of course your separate partnerships. that you walked us through. I wanted to, we have another question for the audience, but I wanted to also just, Tori, circle back to hear who people are partnering with, because I saw a lot of great responses.
Actually, I think a better question is who are people not partnering with, because we got quite a range of responses on our last text chat. So we had folks talking about their partnerships with hospitals and healthcare, with Healthy Start coalitions. Folks also mentioned partnerships with bars and nightlife. Some folks are partnering with attorney generals and prosecutors. Some people are building bridges with other forms of violence like human trafficking. We also saw folks connecting to other public health issues like substance abuse and mental health. Folks who are working in workforce communities. I think it was Falguna had brought up block clubs and some community engagement and community connectedness partnerships that are going on there. Folks who are working with churches and faith communities and city planning. Ashley, were there any others in there that you wanted to highlight?
Well, I did just want to highlight, there was a comment by Monty around, what are the risks, or are there risks, like complicity, for example, when you're partnering with or engaging with powerful sectors, so maybe like a professional sports team. And how do you balance those risks with meaningful community accountability? So I think that's a really important consideration and conversation, especially for folks who, I think we're in kind of this time right now where this issue is being very much part of the national dialogue. And so there might be more opportunities or more asks to partner with some powerful groups and organizations. And so I think that goes back to the question of like, to what end, right? Like to what end is this collaboration? And so, yeah, if folks have thoughts or they've been in situations like that, we'd love to hear how you kind of navigated that, because I do think that's a really great or important consideration. So thank you, Tori. So we'd also love to know, just out of the conversation with Matthew and Sarah and really thinking about how there is so much awesome work happening that we can connect to, but maybe we need to kind of reframe or rephrase some of the language to be able to find those shared values. What are your ideas for doing that? Maybe you do it already, and so what does that look like? What does that sound like? Or what are your ideas for being able to do that? How do you reframe or rephrase prevention work to find those shared values and that shared language with other partners? And while you all think about that and answer it, I want to introduce you to our third guest, Vanessa Crawford Aragon. And Vanessa is a community prevention coordinator for MOXA, or the Metropolitan Organization to Counter Sexual Assault. MOXA is a local agency. And Vanessa, how are you? Are you still there with us?
I sure am. I'm doing great.
Awesome. Well, Vanessa, thank you so much for joining us. And, I have had the opportunity to hear you and your colleagues at MOXA talk about some of the work that you all have done in various settings. And so I'm really excited for you to kind of walk us through what your partnerships have looked like at the local level and how you've gone about that and some of your successes. So I'm going to pass it over to you, and you have the floor.
Great, thanks. So just to, if folks aren't if you haven't seen me present before, just to get you up to date on sort of the project that I'm talking about. I feel like Sarah and Matthew did a great job of laying out some higher level concepts that I think are really important to this work. So I wanted to tell you a little bit more about what those have looked like in application here in Kansas City. So MOXA is actually a bi-state serving organization in Kansas City, so we serve both Kansas and Missouri. But we've had a long-term community committee in Wyandotte County, which is the KCK side of state line. that had for a long time, we had a lot of sort of those traditional partners, those usual suspects that would be part of an awareness and education coalition that were working on things. They would always plan Sexual Assault Awareness Month programming in April, for example, or they really helped facilitate our education relationships with the local school district. But in 2014, because of an opportunity that was given to us through some RPE funding, we changed to a community level prevention coalition. We actually changed the name of the coalition from the advisory committee to YCOSAP, the Sexual Assault Prevention Coalition. We engaged in a needs assessment process. We sort of did a lot of fact-finding and relationship development. When we initially started down this road, it wasn't at all clear what form this was going to take. Sorry, I just advanced my own slide for no reason. It wasn't clear, what the strategies that we were going to use were going to be. And so we knew that this wasn't going to be possible if MOXA was the only organization that was trying to make it happen. So we ended up, sort of after a whole lot of figuring it out, developing a 5-year violence prevention plan that is now integrated into the county's community health improvement plan. So we directly partner with the county health department and another of other agencies to implement this 5-year plan that is part of this overall community health improvement initiative. And so that's really given us a lot of opportunity to expand the type of strategies that our committee or our coalition is engaging in, to expand in the number and type of partners that we are really engaged in, like deep work with, not just folks that we sort of have passing conversations with, but folks that we are working on programming and policy and stuff like that over a long term. So to talk about sort of the issues that we needed to address in terms of building our coalition and addressing or creating more of those multi-sector partnerships, I wanted to just briefly go over some of the priorities that were identified in our assessment, and then how we figured out how to address those. So we did a pretty traditional needs assessment about the community's experience of sexual violence. And some of the things that we found that were, if you're going to do strategies that are going to address this, these are the ways that it is important to the community that happen. So community members expressed a lot of feelings that, violence was inevitable, that there was nothing you could do about it. You can support survivors, but you can't do anything to prevent it. And that was sort of tied with other feelings of community disinvestment. A lot of the same neighborhoods that were experiencing a lot of violence were neighborhoods that have been experiencing community disinvestment by other institutions for a long time due to things like the legacy of redlining in the city, for instance. And so it was really important that our strategies addressed that need. We had identified a lot of physical environment and infrastructure issues were leading to both opportunity for crime and violence in the community, but were also leading to a perception about neighborhoods being unsafe, which was resulting in people isolating, people not engaging in neighborhood activities or knowing about services that were available. So it was really negatively impacting that what can be a protective factor of positive community support and cohesion. And how could we address that through physical environment issues? And then also looking at public policies that were opportunities to impact sexual violence, we identified that there was really no one in the community who had identified a specific policy or that it was their own job to prevent violence. There was a lot of victim support. There was there was the criminal code, right? But there were no policies that were looking at violence prevention in a proactive way. So as you can imagine, some of these things are fit really squarely into the wheelhouse of traditional partners that were already at the table, and some of those things are things that we hadn't worked on yet, that we didn't necessarily have partners at the table that were working on, but we knew were important. And so we really needed to get creative with who our partners were when we were creating those partnerships. So we ended up focusing on these three risk or protective factors: creating safer neighborhoods. So that's not just neighborhoods that are safer from sexual violence, but we know that neighborhood violence is a risk factor for violence that happens inside the home. So how are we developing strategies that address that? How are we increasing community support and connectedness? And how are we addressing cultural norms that impact violence? So things like on the positive side, proactive bystander behavior. How are we encouraging that? How are we addressing harmful norms like gender stereotypes or racism, and how that impacts violence? So it's, I think, pretty evident that's not something that your local rape crisis center is going to be able to take on all by themselves. That's not something that local law enforcement is going to be able to take on all by themselves. And so we needed to join together with a lot of different folks that were doing a lot of different kinds of work. So here's this slide is some logos of partners that are really deeply involved in our work in different ways. We're now moving a number of different strategies that address different aspects of these risk and protective factors. And as you can see, some of these are those traditional anti-violence partners. We've got folks from the local DV shelter. We've got KCAVP is a local organization that serves LGBTQ survivors. We have the school district and the local police department. We also have folks like Bike Walk KC. So they're the leaders on the Community Complete Streets initiative. They're working on physical environment change. We have folks from Livable Neighborhoods, which is in KCK, they have this organization that's the Association of Neighborhood Associations, basically. We have folks from a local faith community. We have folks who are working on the heat cab that is there. Those are folks that are working specifically on health equity and addressing the legacy of racism and redlining and how that has negatively impacted health outcomes and access to resources in the community. So we have all of these partners at the table to take on different aspects of these strategies. And I also would, really like to lift up something that Sarah said earlier when we were talking about it doesn't matter what you call the sandwich. It's also, you're going to have partners at the table who might be working towards the same end, but for a different reason. And that is okay. We've got the Bike Walk KC, for example. I always use them because they're a great partner for us. And they are not explicitly an anti-violence organization. Their objective is, making community infrastructure and public policy that supports pedestrians, cyclists, wheelchair users, public transportation users through community infrastructure. And so we know that when you make those kinds of changes, it gets more people out in the community. using public spaces, meeting their neighbors, and that makes people safer. And they want people, bike walk, it's not that they don't want people to be safer, they do, but the reason that they're making those changes is different than the reasons that we would advocate for those changes. But the fact that we can be transparent with each other about what our objectives are allow us to work together really effectively. So when we decided that we were going to create this 5-year community plan, we needed to be really intentional about how we did that. So I had that previous slide that has all those partners. Each of those organizations has had more than one person that comes to, the coalition meetings on a monthly basis. There are different people who represent different departments within different agencies. And so we needed to be really intentional about who and how folks were participating in that planning process. Because we also realized that if we, tried to do it at a great big meeting, and we certainly wouldn't be able to do it in the time span that was sort of created for us. And so we created a process where we got really honest with each other and set up a pretty clear accountability process to say that we would have a plan drafting committee that would be a committee of the larger coalition, and that would report back and be accountable to that larger coalition, but that would meet more often and would develop these strategies. And so we had a conversation about who needs to be there. So it was pretty clear, from some of those risk and protective factors that I identified, or priority focuses that I said that we'd identified earlier, like the direction we were going in. So we had a conversation about which county departments need to be there, which social service agencies need to be there, and who can sort of carry the water for other folks. So if we have folks from this social service agency there, can they be responsible for answering back to other folks, other social service providers that aren't part of that drafting committee table? And then also, do we have are the individuals who are representing those sectors in the drafting process? Are those people within their organizations that can make decisions and commit folks to the plan, commit their agency to the plan? And so, if you had somebody from the school district, you make sure that you have somebody at the school district who is from the right office and who is at the right decision-making level to make those commitments, or the police department, or even, the local social service agency. Is the frontline staff person who's been coming to the coalition all this time empowered to make those commitments, or do we need to recruit somebody else from that agency to participate in this drafting process? And so that was, I think, a really good opportunity. Like I said, folks were talking about the processes and culture of your partners' organizations, to really learn a lot about your partners and how that culture works. So we utilized the Collaboration Multiplier tool while at the very beginning of this drafting process. So, and I think Ashley and Tori are going to go into it a little bit more deeply here in a minute, but it's a two-phase tool. So the first is this information gathering process. So I scheduled at least an hour with every member of the drafting committee to really sit down and go through this inventory with them, and which we ended up creating a pretty large spreadsheet where we go through those things like this is why this is important to us, and that's different, right, for other folks. Like I mentioned, the reason why community infrastructure is important to our partners at Bike Walk is really different than the reason why community infrastructure is important to the MOXA. But being transparent with each other about what that is really helpful. We talked about expertise and resources that we have available. Folks at the health department were like, well, once we get all this data figured out, we have epidemiologists on staff who can help us analyze it and, put together our objectives for that. So that was a resource that we wouldn't have necessarily known that we had unless we'd had, a really thorough conversation. We talked about what are we already doing as individual agencies, and what other partners do we work with on a regular basis that we can help bring to the table. And so that was a really useful process for us. And then we actually added on an additional question. So what is on your screen in blue, that is the standard form that the Prevention Institute created. We added a question about concerns. So as we're embarking on this planning process, what are concerns that you want to make sure that we're holding as we go forward? So, for example, I talked about the built environment change that we were doing. A couple partners identified really clearly that they wanted to make sure that any built environment strategies that we were implementing took a very careful look at how they were being applied in terms of equity, making sure that we weren't using sort of policing and enforcement, like code enforcement type strategy onto people that were already living in marginalized neighborhoods. And that was something, and that was a really easily accepted value for the rest of the committee to take on, but it was really important that somebody articulated that and really laid it on the table. Other concerns that folks had were in terms of capacity, just straight up, we're biting off a really ambitious piece of this apple, and we want to make sure that we're not committing to things that we won't be able to take on because of the way that could negatively impact our relationship with community or partners or just to get the work done. Again, that was something that was once somebody said it, they were like, yeah, of course you're right. Of course you're right. We'll make sure that that's something that we consider. But it created an opportunity to really lay everybody's cards out on the table. And so then when things like plans change, we actually, I didn't mention at the beginning of this, when we started this planning process, this violence prevention plan process, we weren't part of the health department's community health improvement plan. We were trying to do it on our own. And when we were invited to participate with the health department, that required us to sort of reformat some things, and it actually ended up extending our process by quite a bit of time. So that was an important opportunity that presented itself, but it really did change plans for us for the better. But having everybody's cards out on the table, all the considerations that everybody was working with, really helped that go a lot better. It also created a really valuable basis of relationship. Since I was the organizer, I was the person who was having those conversations, but it also created more trust and transparency across the table. And so we could have pretty tough conversations. We had folks from law enforcement, we had folks from agencies that serve communities that feel really marginalized from law enforcement. And so when we were talking about what types of strategies were possible for us to implement, we were able to have some pretty tough conversations about why don't people call 911 when they need help, right? Which that is not a conversation that would happen necessarily if it was, just traditional partners. If violence prevention was only being held, by the law enforcement justice system part of the community. So we were able to take the information that was gathered in that phase 1 and then moved into this phase 2, which you can see the diagram of how that gets laid out. So we were able to go through each of those risk and protective factors and say, okay, for community connectedness, here's what everybody's doing, here's what everybody is trying to achieve, here are the resources that folks have available. And that really helped expedite the planning process because we didn't have to then go back and have another 100 hours of conversation with everybody at the table about what I'm doing, what you're doing, what nobody's doing. Looking at like the big lessons learned for us, as I mentioned, it's really important to think strategically about both the individuals and the agencies that are part of your planning. You can have somebody who's the wrong person from the right agency, and that can really make things more difficult. You want to make sure, and I think the Collaboration Multiplier tool really helps make this happen. You don't want to compete with existing community initiatives. You want to figure out how you fit in with those existing community initiatives and add value. I don't want my partner to take on a whole new program that they weren't already doing, or I don't want my partner to have to compete with me to do this violence prevention programming. I want to figure out how we slot in with that work that's already happening and make it even more beneficial for everybody who's implementing or participating in it. And as I said, clarity about objectives allows collaboration for shared goals, even if your missions or your reasons for engaging are really different. So I would just, really stress being as transparent and accountable with your partners as possible throughout that process.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. I really appreciate you sharing about your partnerships and what that relationship building process has been like. We are interested in hearing from our audience about what considerations you've really thought that need to be taken into account when establishing new partnerships. And I think that conversation did start with Monty's question earlier around, what could that look like when we want to make sure that, we're not bringing in partners that maybe can be more harmful to what we're trying to work against. And I think, Vanessa, you also touched on that at the local level with working with like law enforcement and criminal justice and how to, what that could look like. I want to go back while folks think about that to the Collaboration Multiplier just real quick. Tori did put a link to where you can download that. And so it's really a worksheet. It's meant to be used in planning your collaborative efforts really across sectors. And so Vanessa, I thought I was really appreciative of you walking through like how you used it, that you scheduled time with folks, and really how it was utilized in your work. But I just want to say, I think that when Prevention Institute created it, they also meant for it to be used even if you're already engaged in a partnership. So this doesn't have to be something that you do right from the beginning, but if you're already working together, you can use it to really help identify maybe the activities that you're working on to achieve common goals. Maybe you identify gaps through this information gathering phase, missing sectors that you really need to be able to contribute to the solutions that you're after. You can really make visible the different like perspectives and expertise and resources from your different partners. And then I think in the analysis phase, which is what this slide is pointing to, this is really where it's meant to help the partners navigate the differences in finding approaches that, despite, as you said, Vanessa, maybe having different missions, we can advance our objectives simultaneously. And so the analysis phase really kind of helps like create a roadmap for that. So I just wanted to go back and touch on that. Matthew and Sarah, what tips do you have for folks around considerations when it comes to collaboration?
Yeah, so
go ahead, Matthew.
Sorry, go ahead, Sarah.
So one of the things that, one of the feedback pieces that we've gotten is sometimes when you're thinking about prevention and building partnerships is that you wish there was just like a magic way to be able to like get everyone on the same page and to like make the partnership work from day one. And so I think just knowing that there is no magic formula or pill for creating strong partnerships, it takes time, it takes energy and resources to build partnerships. And I think that's helpful to remember.
Yeah, and then just to go back to a point that Vanessa made, anticipate conflict and then know how to manage your reactions to that. So whenever Vanessa really talked about being transparent and accountable about your intentions, I think that's really important because there might be times whenever conflict does arise, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. But then the way that we react when conflict does occur in our partnership is something that we need to be really mindful about.
Great. Thank you, Sarah and Matthew. Vanessa, what about some tips from you all at Moxa?
Yeah, okay. So if folks haven't learned any words today, transparent and accountable seem to be the words of the day. You know, I think it's also really important to talk about being reciprocal with your partnerships. It's really unreasonable to expect your partners to put in a lot of time and effort onto a big project that you're leading without, you know, reciprocal participation on your part in some of their efforts. And so that can look some different ways. As I mentioned, that can mean making sure the strategies that you're working to implement, you know, are really helping and creating value for partners who are participating in those. It can also mean that, and what this looks like for me a lot is I'm not just going to my own coalition meetings that I'm running, but I'm actively participating in other community coalitions that are maybe working on things that are related to violence prevention, or maybe they're not working on something that's explicitly violence prevention, but I understand how it's related to that thing. It doesn't matter what you call the sandwich, right? Our coalition partners with one of our faith communities that we work with every year to host a park cleanup in a neighborhood that is part of the focus of the violence prevention plan. And so we really clearly understand how inviting partners to participate in something like a park cleanup in a public space in a neighborhood that experiences a significant level of violence. We understand how that's violence prevention, but man, that sure doesn't look like you know, standard programming from your local rape crisis center. So you know, we had to be really open and reciprocal with our partners about not only asking them to participate with us, but us meaningfully and participating with them.
Thanks, Vanessa. I think that's important to be reciprocal in that. I just have a couple of resources to share with you all, but I know everyone got real quiet when we asked that last question, but I'm going to just take a chance and ask a final one, because we'd love to know, what are some of the new partnerships that you're considering in your work? Are there partnerships that you've been thinking about would be really important to get where you all want to be with your prevention work? Who are those folks? So we'd love for you to just pop those into the text chat if you do have folks identified or groups identified. So a couple of tools and resources. So we did do a web conference looking at local approaches to preventing multiple forms of violence, and that did feature some really exciting multi-sector collaborations. So there was housing, collaborating with housing, and there's also collaborating with suicide prevention. So you can get that recording. Also want to direct you, of course, to the Collaboration Multiplier as a tool and a resource. Prevention Institute also has a number of reports around multi-sector approaches to preventing violence, so you can find those. And then they also have a health equity and multi-sector approach to preventing domestic violence report. Tori's giving you all of these links. And then our friends over at TASA, the Texas Association Against Sexual Assault, they do have this resource on engaging communities in sexual violence prevention. And so there's some good tips just to keep in mind whenever you're trying to, build a coalition or bring people together. How do we make people's time useful, and how do we actually get things accomplished? So it's great to see folks looking to build coalitions with non-conventional partners, especially. Oh, I love the health equity zone work that you all do in Rhode Island, looking at partnering with nightlife, youth serving organizations. So thank you all so much for sharing. And we are out of time today, but I want to thank Vanessa, Sarah, Matthew, my colleague Tori, for being involved in this web conference, and of course all of you for sharing your insight and your ideas and experiences and questions around this topic. So I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your, I believe it's Thursday. You will be receiving an email from us when this recording is available. So that should be coming to your inbox in the next week or so. But thank you again for joining us, and we hope to see you on a future Prevent Connect web conference. Take care.
Thanks.